My family. I'm not ready to face my family. So I landed in Fresno, California. The first person I called is a kid I went to college with. He was a Fresno State football player, tight end, big 6'6" white kid. This kid had a couple of stints with the San Diego Chargers. He was married to a Fresno State cheerleader who I was really close with, and she was raising two kids the same age as my kids. He picked me up at the airport in his Cadillac Escalade. I jumped in, he looked at me, he said, "Chris, man, you don't look good." I said, "Man, I don't feel good." He said, "Don't worry about it, I got you covered. Open up the middle console." I opened up the middle console, there's a ½ ounce of blow. There's a finger of black tar heroin. He said, "There's needles in the glove box, dog. You can get off now or you can wait till we get back to my house." So me and this professional football player drove back to his house. We went through the gated community. We walked into this big monster house, and the first person who I met coming to the front door was this 22-year-old girl named Lisa. Lisa was his personal assistant. She went into the office. Me and the football player went in the living room. For the next 5 days, we smoked coke and shot dope. For 5 days straight, no sleep, no food, just booze and drugs. 5 days of no sleep and just booze and drugs, you start hallucinating, you start getting paranoid, you start thinking the police have the house surrounded. For 5 days straight, we didn't move. The last 2 days, we locked ourselves in a bedroom. On day 5, my phone was ringing in my pocket. I pulled it out. When I pulled it out, I answered it by accident. It was my wife. My wife said, "Chris, the kids miss you. They haven't seen you for so long. I got a flight. We're in Chicago. We'll be at the airport in 2 hours. Pick us up." Yo, I haven't left this bedroom for 2 days. I jumped in the shower, I took a hot shower, I grabbed the keys to the Escalade, and I start driving. As I'm driving down the highway, I feel like people are following me, so I pull off and I wait 20 minutes. I get back on. It's funny, right? It's sick, but it's... I pull over and I wait 20 more minutes. Here's where the pain sets in. 6.5 hours of this torture. I pull the car over. I drop the keys. I walk out in front of the Escalade. I watch the cars buzz by me in the high-speed lane. And then I said, "It's a wrap. I'm not living like this no more." I'm 4 hours late to pick up my wife and kids. I waited for the next car, and as soon as that next car came, when I thought it was the right time, I jumped. When I jumped, the car swerved, and the next car behind it hit the brakes. The woman skid right in front of me. She jumped out of her car, she took one look at me, she jumped back in the car, locked her doors, and called 911. A minute later, I saw the police lights, and I started running down the highway to the police. I told the police officers, "I'm under the influence of heroin and cocaine, man, just take me away. I can't live like this no more." They took my pulse, they said they thought I was going into cardiac arrest, so they called the EMTs. The EMTs brought me to the hospital, shot me up with sedatives. When they were done with the sedatives, they transferred me to Modesto County Jail. I woke up the next morning in that jail cell with 40 dudes I'd never seen before. That night, I heard my name called. I walked to the window. The sheriff said, "You've been released. Here's your summons. Show up to court in 2 weeks to face your felony charges." When I walked out, he said, "Stop at the glass window and pick up your belongings." I went up to this glass window, and the guy said name. I said, "Chris Herron." He picked up his head. He said, "Are you the guy that used to play for the Celtics in Fresno State?" I said, "Yes, sir." He slid me my belongings, a 10, a 5, and 2 1s, and he said, "What a shame." I took that 17 bucks. I walked out of jail, and as soon as I hit the sidewalk in Modesto, California, I said, if I'm going to do one thing right in my life, today I'm going homeless. I will never contact my kids again. I'm tired of breaking their heart. So I walked into a 7-Eleven. I bought a soda. I went behind a 7-Eleven. I jumped in a dumpster. I grabbed the cardboard. I laid the dumpster between the dumpster and the chain link fence, and that's where I slept that night. I woke up the next morning to 2 homeless men touching me with their feet, saying, "Are you okay?" When I looked up, the 2 homeless men picked me up off the ground. When he picked me up off the ground, he told me, "We got a sign in the homeless shelter down the street." We walked to this homeless shelter. I signed my name in for that night, and for the next 3 hours, me and the 2 homeless men walked the streets of Modesto, and with that $17, I was buying 40 ounces of malt liquor. When I was down to the last $2.50, I walked into the liquor store to buy that last 40 ounce. When I was at the counter, the homeless man came in behind me and said, "No, he's not buying it." I turned around and said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Don't worry about it. Give him change." I looked at him. He said, "Christopher, please, do me a favor. Just go to the payphone, call your wife, tell her you're sorry, and have her come pick you up." I went to the payphone. I called my wife. When my wife answered, she said, "Where are you?" I gave her the address. She hung up the phone. 9 hours later, I was sleeping in that spot between the dumpster and the chain link fence, and my wife pulled up. I jumped in the car, and my kids were in the back seat, and next thing I heard, my 2 children, Christopher and Samantha, crying in the back seat, asking me why I don't want to be their dad anymore. "How come you don't want to pick us up at the airport?" That night when I got home, that football player called me up. When that football player called me up, he said, "My man, you must be so sick." And I said, "I am sick, Kev." He said, "Don't worry about it. Tonight at 12:30, let Heather, Christopher, and Samantha fall asleep. We're going to pick you up." Jump in the car, we'll blast back to my house, get high, and we'll get you back before anybody wakes up. No one's gonna know you were gone. For the first time in my life, I said no. I said, nah, man, I'm good. I hung up the phone. He called me back at 1:30 in the morning. Remember that, 1:30 in the morning. I looked at that phone. I wanted to go. I looked at my kid sleeping. When I went to answer, it said missed call. I put the phone back down. I fell back asleep. The next time I answered, it was at 5:30 in the morning. It was my wife, Heather. I mean, it was his wife, Heidi. As soon as I answered the phone, all I heard was screams. Screaming and crying. And after 2 minutes of screaming and crying, she finally said, were you with him last night? And I said, no. She said, just put on the news. I put on the news. When I put on the news, I saw his house. I saw yellow tape and I saw police lights. And then a woman stepped in front of the camera and said, last night at 2:30 in the morning, an unknown assailant kicked in the front door of a former football player. When police arrived on scene, they found the former football player and the 22-year-old girl, Lisa, on the living room floor with bullet holes in their forehead, executed. First time in my life I said no to drugs. It saved my life. After the murder investigation, I jumped on a plane. From 28 years old to 32 years old, I was a stone-cold street junkie. My kids went to bed with no heat. My kids went to bed with no lights. My kids went to bed with no food. At 30 years old, I was arrested for stealing groceries for my children. 5 years earlier, I was making $500,000 playing basketball. 6 years earlier, I was a Boston Celtic. Now I can't even buy baby formula for my daughter. On June 4, 2008, I put little Chris on a school bus, 9 years old. Samantha, 7 years old, and I said, Daddy will be here when you get off. I went to the liquor store, I bought my pint of vodka for $2. I got 30 bucks together, I drove to Fall River, I bought 4 bags of heroin, I sat on a side street and I banged it. I don't remember banging. The next thing I remember is found 3.5 miles away from where I shot up. I went through a lane of traffic, jumped the curb, and crashed into a cemetery fence. The police report said my skin was gray, my lips were blue, and my eyes were behind my head, and Narcan, which reverses overdoses, wasn't kicking in. The EMTs pronounced me dead, left me slumped over my steering wheel with a needle in my arm. The police officer pulled up on scene and said I went to high school with him. He has 2 children, get him in the ambulance. They put me in the ambulance and they hit me with paddles. And when I popped up, the police officer grabbed me by my throat and threw me back down and told me to keep my mouth shut because I was dead 30 seconds earlier. I walked into this hospital where I grew up right down the street where my dad was a politician. That was his district. The doctor walked in, he spent 2 minutes with me, he told me I was free to go. The officer uncuffed me, handed me a summons and said, be in court in 2 weeks to face your felony charges. At this point, I'm a 7-time convicted felon. I walked out of that hospital and I said, if I'm gonna do one thing right, I'm gonna do it today. My homeboy lives 2 blocks away from here and I'm gonna walk into his bedroom, I'm grabbing his gun, I'm sticking it in my mouth and I'm blowing my head off. Because I'm tired of dragging my kids through the mud, I'm tired of living this life. And as I'm walking out of the hospital, I hear this woman screaming my name. She's screaming my name and I look back, it's an older woman who's a nurse. And I ignore her and I keep walking. As I'm walking, she said, Chris, I went to high school with your mom. My mom died at a young age. And that spun me around. I said, why are you talking about my mom? And she said, I'm not. Your mom's talking to me, telling me to help her son. So I went back into the hospital with this woman. I cried for the next 5 hours, and she picked up the phone and said, I got a former NBA basketball player who has no money, no health insurance. Will you give him a chance? Finally, this place said, we'll give him 5 days. After the 5th day, they were discharging me, and the phone rang, and it was Chris Mullen. Chris Mullen called my phone and said, me and my wife want to pay for you to go away for treatment for 6 months in Rhinebeck, New York. Tomorrow there'll be a limousine, jump in, get there, go to treatment, get your life back. I jumped in that limousine, I went to that place. For the first 35 days, I had no contact with my family. On day 35, I heard my name called. I went down to the office and the counselor said, it's your wife on the phone. I answered it, my wife was crying. She said, Chris, I'm going into labor. When I was found on the side of the road, my wife was 8 months pregnant, expecting our 3rd child. I looked at the counselor and said, I gotta go home. He said, no, man, you can't go home. I said, listen, there's no choice in this. I was high for little Chris's birth. I was high for Samantha's birth. I'm gonna be sober for Drew. I jumped in the taxi. I went to the train station. I walked into Women's and Infants Hospital. When I got there, I walked in. Drew was born. 2 hours later, I held that little boy in my arms for 4 hours, sober and proud. 4 hours later, a knock on the door. A nurse came in and said, there's 2 little kids in the hallway that want to meet their little brother. Little Chris and Samantha came running in the room. I put Drew into Chris's arms. I said, I'll be right back, and I never came back. I went right to the liquor store, right to the crack house, and started shooting heroin that night. I left my kids in the hospital. When I walked into my house that night at 1 o'clock in the morning, my kids were sitting on the couch crying, saying, Dad, I can't believe you did this to us. When I walked into the hospital the next day, my wife, who was laying in the hospital bed, who I met in the 7th grade, my wife knew me long before I was a junkie, but long before I was an NBA basketball player. She said, "You broke my heart 1,000,000 times. The last time you break my kid's heart. Get out of my hospital room." I walked out of that hospital room. I walked back to the train station. I went back to this place in New York. When I got back to this place in New York, the counselor who told me not to go home met me at the front door and he said, "Mr. Basketball, you had a tough home visit." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Don't worry about it. It happens all the time. Be in my office at 10 o'clock. I'm going to fix this for you." At 10 o'clock sharp, I knocked on his door. He told me to come in. When I walked in, he saw me. He flipped me a cell phone. I caught the cell phone. He said, "Now, Christopher, you're going to do the best thing you've ever done in your life, the most noble, courageous thing you've ever done." He said, "Flip that cell phone, call your wife, tell your wife that you will disappear. Promise her you'll never contact her again. And to tell your 3 children when you left them in the hospital this morning that you died in a car accident. Because you're a no-good scumbag, loser junkie who doesn't deserve kids." And I looked at this man. I tossed him the phone back and I said, "My man, I've been telling myself that for 10 years. I know exactly what I am." I walked back to my room, I dropped to my knees and I started praying. The day I dropped to my knees was August 1st, 2008. That's my sobriety day. As I said in the beginning, I traveled to try to get out in front of one of you. The first high school I spoke at had 1,800 kids in this auditorium. And as I was getting done, the principal walked up to me and said, "Last question." So I looked in this room of 1,800 kids and all of a sudden this little girl popped her hand up right over here and I walked up close so I could hear her. And as I walked up close to hear her, there were a bunch of knuckleheads in that crowd who laughed and told her to put her hand down. So this little girl who had the courage to raise her hand in front of 1,800 kids in her school dropped her hand and sank in her seat. I ended the assembly, I went home. 7 days later I got an email and it said, "Subject, Dartmouth." That's the name of the high school. I clicked on it and said, "Dear Mr. Herron, I was the girl who wanted to ask you the question in the assembly. The question I wanted to ask you was not about substance abuse, it was about bullying." She said, It's okay. My dad's a drunk. My dad's a drunk and my mom lost her job 2 years ago. So for the last 2 years I've been walking into my school with the same school clothes. And what you wear at my school matters. And there's a group of girls and boys that make fun of me when I walk down the hallways about how I dress. And I don't know if you remember me, but I'm far from the prettiest girl in my school. She said, "Mr. Herron, I'm 17 years old. I can't find heroin and I can't find cocaine, but if I could, I'd do it. What I do find is I go home from school every day, I lock myself in my room, I pull out my razor blade, and I cut. I've been cutting myself for 2 years because of this." She said, "Well, I'm going to tell you something right now. You coming to my school telling your nightmare, sharing your nightmare, telling your secrets gave me the courage to tell mine." So I walked into school the next day and I walked by their lunch table and I heard the chatter. When I heard the chatter, I turned around, I flipped it, I went back to their table, I sat down, I rolled up my sleeves, and I showed them my cuts. She said, "Mr. Herron, all 6 girls turned away, 2 cried and walked away from the table, but I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart because those girls have never said a word to me ever again." That girl sent me an email 2 weeks ago, said she had 13 months clean of cutting. That's better than any contract I've ever signed in my life. That's better than any uniform I've ever put on. I spoke at a high school and I was in a room like this, much bigger. And there was 6 seats right in the front row. 6 seats, and all of a sudden these kids came in and everybody was dressed normal except these 6 kids, and they sat in the front row and they had these solid purple shirts on. And I'm looking at these kids, I'm like, who the heck are these kids with the purple shirts? And when I was done with my talk, the girl raised her hand and she stood up. And she said, "Mr. Herron, I want to thank you for coming to my school and validating what we do." And I said, "Well, what do you do?" And she said, "At the beginning of every school year, we sign a contract. We sign a contract that we won't participate or partake in any drug or alcohol-related activity." And then she said, "We're the sober students of the high school." And after the kids laughed, pockets, I looked at the kids who laughed and I said, "You should be ashamed of yourself." And then I looked at this little girl and the only words that could come out of my mouth was, "I wish."